So today I am going to talk you through my thesis, just kind of outline a bit of what I've done and a lot of what I'm planning to do. This title is not a great one. I need a better title for my thesis, so if anyone has any ideas, that would be good. So at the moment, I'm just the view that I'm defending is, it's a version of a Wittgensteinian kind of justification, and it's a contextualist version of that, so I've called it Contextualist Wittgensteinian Justification, but obviously that's horrible. So what I'm planning to do is just explain what this view is. So I'll start out by explaining the Wittgensteinian view of justification, which Drew actually did a nice version of earlier in his questions, and then I'll explain very briefly how I want to make it contextualist. Then I'm going to explain some objections that arise when we make this view contextualist, and I'm going to take the interesting option of not responding to those objections in this talk. I'm just going to I'll explain why at the time, but partly it's because some of you have heard that stuff before, so it'd be a little bit boring and I wanted to focus on something new. But I'm just going to explain that those objections are there. If you want to ask me any questions, I could kind of wave my hand a bit. But what I really want to focus on is exploring the applications of this view and what we can use it for, because that's what I'm kind of finding interesting at the moment, so it'd be really good to get your feedback on that. It's still quite open-ended. First of all, what is Wittgenstein's view of justification? So he thinks that justification is limited, so the practice of questioning different propositions, doubting them, and the practice of supporting those propositions with evidence or reasoning, we can't just carry on doing that forever. That's his point. For every single proposition that you believe, I can't enter a challenge and question it. There has to be an end to that process. That's his basic view. The argument for this is the one which Drew was talking about earlier. So the first premise is that for a subject, this premise kind of tells us what it means to support or doubt something. So for a subject to support or to doubt a proposition P, her basis for this support must be more certain than the proposition P itself is. So the idea here is that, so if you look out the window and say that I can see that it's snowing, I can't just turn around and say, how do you know that it's snowing? So there are certain situations where I could, if I've got a really good reason, like a really good basis for that question, for that doubt, then I could. So if I've just seen you take a pill, which I know to be hallucinogenic, then I could say, well, hang on, do you know that it's snowing? Like, you've just taken this pill. But in normal situations, when you just say, oh, look, it's snowing, I can't just say, how do you know it's snowing? That's kind of inappropriate for me to do. The second premise is that some propositions we believe are maximally certain for us. So there are a few different ways that I could talk about this, but this is just kind of the simplest one. I think it's kind of fairly obvious. If I just took all of the propositions that you believe and lined them all up, or grouped them in terms of how certain they are for you, we could have some at this end that were not very certain, they're things that you're not that confident in, group them and keep going further back and back until we get to this end where we've got the ones which you're really certain in. And at some point, assuming you don't believe in an infinite number of propositions, at some point we're going to get to some which are more certain than any other. And that's what we're calling maximally certain. So at some point we'll get to one or a group of propositions where there's not going to be anything else past them. We've just got to the end. Okay? So it follows from those 2 points that some propositions can't be supported or doubted. So we've got these propositions at the end which are maximally certain, there's nothing more certain than they are. And then if we want to question those propositions or if we want to doubt them, we have to present something, we have to have a basis which is more certain. But there's nothing more certain than those things. They're right at that end of the spectrum. So they can't be supported or doubted. So that's why just this practice of justification is supposed to be limited. Okay, so this gives us a picture of justification which looks a little bit like a Christmas tree. Very, very slightly like a Christmas tree. So we end up with some propositions at the bottom, which are, I'll explain why in a minute, but they're called hinge propositions or hinge commitments. And these are propositions at the bottom which are the most certain ones, and they're the ones which, that's where justification is limited to. We can't question them, we can't support them. And those give rise to kind of higher up beliefs, maybe more complex beliefs. And the higher up beliefs are more, they're less certain, but they are justified in virtue of their connection to the hinge commitments. And to explain why the lower tier of beliefs are called hinge propositions, we can compare this to foundationalism. So at the moment, this looks quite a lot like a foundationalist picture of justification. So a foundationalist would just draw a similar picture and say that the beliefs at the bottom are basic or self-justifying. So they say that that's something like I see a red thing before me, and that just kind of justifies itself. You can't get in there and doubt it because it's maybe not quite a priori, but there's something about it, it's just kind of self-justifying. That's different to what Wittgenstein says. So Wittgenstein doesn't have to think that these hinge propositions are self-justifying. So it's not that we are justified in believing them, it's not that we know them. Instead, the idea is just that they're beyond justification in some way. So that's why we can't question them. But still, they're allowed to, or they kind of, they don't give justification to the other beliefs. It's not that they transmit it, because they don't have any justification to give. But in virtue of being connected to those propositions, the other beliefs are justified. So the reason it's called a hinge proposition, Wittgenstein compares it to a door. So if you've got a door, it needs to have something which stays fixed in order for the door to turn. It's part of the, maybe not the logic of doors, but it's like a necessary condition that something has to stay immobile, and that's the case here too. That was a bit quick, hopefully that makes some sort of sense. And very briefly, the way to make this contextualist, which is something that Duncan has done, there's a guy called Michael Williams who's taken this view. You basically just say that instead of having one single set of hinge propositions like this, you have lots of different hinge propositions, different sets of hinge propositions. So depending on which context you're in, you'll have a different set of hinge propositions, which is the maximally certain set for you, and that gives rise to different beliefs which are justified for you. So just very briefly, that's kind of the outline of the view that I want to defend. So I think this view is pretty plausible, and especially when you make it contextualist, I think it's got a lot to say for it. I quite like this view, but there are some problems that people have pointed out with it, especially when you try to contextualise it. So I've put this in terms of some questions which I need to answer in my thesis. So the first one is going to be how we distinguish context. So think of it like this: how many different contexts are you supposed to be in during one day? Is it supposed to be that generally you're just in one context, and maybe if you take on some kind of weird kind of hobby or activity like doing philosophy, then you kind of pop into a different context for a bit? Or is it that every time you get on and off a bus, your context changes, you're in hundreds of different contexts each day? There are lots of different views on this, and I need to take a stand on that at some point. I'm not 100% sure where I am at the moment, but that's one question which needs to be answered. Another question is, why should we believe our hinge propositions? So what's the epistemic force behind them? What's the normative force behind them? Especially once we kind of abandon the foundationalist idea of saying that, oh, these are just objectively justified. Some people might worry about why it is that we should believe them. And especially when you make it a contextualist view, because Wittgenstein has some stuff to say about that, but especially when you make it contextualist, which isn't necessarily Wittgenstein's view, well then it looks like we've got lots of different sets of hinge propositions. So I've got one set of hinge propositions and you've got another, if we're individuating them according to different people. So once I acknowledge that fact, why should I believe mine rather than somebody else's? That looks like an open question. And again, it's something that I need to at some point give an answer to. And then the final kind of objection or worry that I'm interested in is, well, it kind of goes like this. This view sounds a bit like relativism. I think relativism is bad. I think this view sounds bad. So there are kind of two issues to that. So one is this a relativist view? You might think it is because if we've got all these different sets of hinge propositions, we're going to have different beliefs which could be conflicting but equally justified. That sounds quite relativist. And then the other part of this question is that a problem? So a lot of people seem to just kind of say relativism is problematic without exploring too much why it's problematic. So that's another question which I need to answer. So I have got some kind of ideas about this, about how I want to answer these different questions. But part of the problem here is that they're all quite interdependent and interlinked. And I'm not totally sure yet how I want to pull out the different threads and try to kind of untangle them and make this all a consistent picture. So I don't want to commit myself to anything too definite at the moment, although I have got some ideas. So one thing that I've been thinking lately is the way to try and clarify my ideas on this is to take a step back and look at what I want the view to do, what I want it to be used for. And once I've got that idea clear, then it should help me work out what I need the context to look like, for example, and then that'll help me to answer the other questions. So, with that in mind, these are the different applications that I think there are for the view. And there are loads of them, hopefully. So I think it should be quite a useful view. So first of all, the thing that I was initially interested in was kind of traditional epistemological worries like skepticism. So this is something that's kind of been talked about a lot today already. But the basic idea is if you've got some kind of skeptical paradox, like the closure-based paradox, you can, well, there are different ways to do it using a kind of Wittgensteinian contextualist view. But one thing to say, which I think is what Duncan says, is that once you've got, so take the second premise of the closure-based skeptical argument. It says something like, if you can't know that you're not a brain in a vat, then you can't know that you've got hands. And so one way to think of that is to say, well, actually, look, propositions or commitments like knowing that you're not a brain in a vat, they're beyond justification, or they're beyond knowledge. They're not the kinds of things that we know, they're not the kind of things that we can justify in that way. So that premise is just kind of it's just kind of confused, that premise. So you can accept in certain cases that it's okay for you to know that you have hands, even if you don't know something which looks like it's kind of entailed by that. So I could say that I do know that I have hands, even though I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, but only in certain cases. So I guess something similar to what Kevin was saying earlier. Go through these ones quite quickly. So also in social epistemology, I think there are lots of applications here. This is stuff I've thought about less. But so for example, in the disagreement literature, there's a question about what it means to be an epistemic peer and what you should do when you're faced with an epistemic peer who disagrees with you. And I think that the idea of hinge propositions in these different contexts can possibly help us to cash this idea out. So one thing that people sometimes say with the disagreement literature is if there's somebody who I think is an epistemic peer, but then I find out they disagree with me on something, then one response is to say, actually, it turns out I was wrong, they're not an epistemic peer, because they disagree with me on this really important issue, so they must just be epistemically inferior to me. That's one option you can take. But it looks like you want to be careful about when you take that. You don't want to take that all the time, because otherwise you're just going around saying, well, actually, I'm just smarter than everybody else, I'm more rational, nobody else is my peer, something like that. So I think maybe if we've got a better idea of hinge propositions and what common ground we have with people and what non-common ground we have, then we can try to explore this idea of disagreement. Also feminist epistemology, so one kind of strand of feminist epistemology talks about knowledge being situated. So instead of the traditional view, which was like Descartes sitting down and writing meditations and having this idea that anyone that picked that up could just go through the same process as him and come to the same conclusions, instead of that, you want to say that, well, actually different people have kind of different social environments and that affects kind of the conclusions that they'll draw. So again, this seems like hinge propositions and like a contextualist view is going to be really useful there. If I'm right about disagreement and feminist epistemology, then it looks like we're going to have some applications in meta-philosophy and in academia more widely. So for example, with disagreement, if we've got a really good idea of what we should do when we disagree with someone who's an epistemic peer, well, that's going to really help us out. For example, when you ask me questions and you disagree with me, I'm going to know what to do if I've got a really good idea of hinge propositions. That's sort of the idea there. And also issues like the kind of issues that people are becoming interested in now with minorities in philosophy. If we've got a kind of a really good understanding of situated knowledge and feminist epistemology, that might help us out there. And then finally, kind of more everyday applications. So like political and religious debates, all this stuff about disagreement is going to be really useful there. So if I'm in a debate with somebody who supports UKIP, it looks like I want to say that they're wrong, they're not justified in their beliefs, and I'm kind of really interested in how we can do that, other than just saying, no, you're wrong, I'm not convincing them. So I think having a good idea of what common ground we have with hinge propositions could lead to more productive debates, because as well as just saying, no, that person is wrong, we can look at, I think it can possibly help us work out our common ground and work out how we can convince other people, or how they can convince us. So I think I'm running over time, so I'll leave it at that. But thank you.